This is my experience as the writer-director making the film adaptation of The Real Anthony Fauci, two-part documentary based on the book by Robert F. Kennedy Jr. I'll start off telling you briefly about my background. I've been working in film and TV for 16 years. While I was at school, I worked on set for various indie films and applied to several TV networks and boutique production houses in Manhattan, and soon landed a job at BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation in America. I learned the ropes of writing and producing. I worked on original series, comedy shows.
Shamelessly saucy. You and Julia weren't just watching television, were you?
What makes you say that?
Reality shows.
I'm closing the restaurant.
Last restaurant standing.
Documentaries.
I'm saying I'm a man, but I'm walking around half male, half woman.
The creative services department there was small enough that I was able to learn many areas of post-production, and I just really ate it up. It was really an amazing experience, and I worked with some amazing people. From there I moved to HBO. Documentaries.
My name is...
HBO really encouraged my creativity, so I was producing and editing.
Would you like to hear a story? There's a girl and a dog, and there's a tornado. Well, no.
Welcome to Australia.
The most successful and popular series that I worked on was Game of Thrones. I worked on the first season, the launch of Game of Thrones. And as one of the many producer editors, I worked on promotional pieces and behind-the-scenes short movies.
I've done feature films, and I've not seen anything on this massive scale.
It's pretty intense.
I remember reading that scene in the book and just thinking, well, something's going to come along to save him, because obviously Ned's not going to die, it's Ned. And then it doesn't.
I also worked for Cinemax and Nickelodeon and others. And what was great also was because it's a lot more rigid than filmmaking. So I kind of started off learning the sort of formulas that you needed to abide by, and work at an extremely fast pace with insane deadlines that you just could not miss. It was not an option. It was a really excellent experience. It taught me a lot of discipline in this space. After TV, I wanted to work on more films. I did some research work for Doug Liman's political thriller about the CIA operative Valerie Plame's memoir. That was a movie starring Naomi Watts and Sean Penn, and it was called Fair Game. I also worked as an editor in various genres: psychological thrillers, dramas, documentaries, comedies, a romantic comedy with director Nick Brooks, who is the son of Mel Brooks, who was the executive producer of this cute little film that we did called Sam. I also spent 2 years working on a political documentary about the corporate media called The Brainwashing of My Dad. I worked closely with the director, Jen Sanko. She's an award-winning indie documentary filmmaker who was telling her personal story about her father.
But this isn't a story about just one man. It's the story about a media phenomenon that changed a father and divided a nation.
The movie was produced and narrated by actor Matthew Modine, and the interviews included media experts such as Noam Chomsky, Edward Herman, political consultants and commentators like David Brock, Frank Luntz, and many others. I was editing, co-writing, and researching. That's when I learned about the concerted manipulation of mainstream news outlets, particularly that they are owned by just a handful of corporations that have specific political agendas, and which is obviously the opposite of what we want them to have, especially when we're trying to get our unbiased news, local or global or whatever. So fast forward to 2020, and the subject of the media manipulation would come up again. What was most interesting and surprising was that during COVID, I noticed that even the independent media outlets that I had begun to trust, they were turning as well. They seemed to be parroting what the corporate media was saying. So things became very obvious to me then, and I assumed it was the same for all of my open-minded, thoughtful, independent thinking fellow New Yorkers who had always been standing up against big corporations. But interestingly, that was just simply not the case. And that started me on a path of researching the truth and coming to know more intimately the people whose voices had been suppressed now for decades. Just kind of looking into whatever the media was telling us, I would then do a little bit of my own background checks. And if there was a study, for example, a medical or scientific study, who was funding that study, who owned it? And a lot of the times it would lead back to those same characters. During this, I found independent journalists that were providing links to official documents and real studies, just sourcing their works. Every time that they wrote an article or did their independent newscasts, I would be able to see the links to everything that they talked about in the descriptions or, linked into their articles, such as the defender of Children's Health Defense. And at the time, I felt it was so important to save these documents, to download certain documentaries and videos and news sources and things like that. Then I heard about Bobby's book, The Real Anthony Fauci, and I started to read it in November 2021. And it was mind-blowing. I felt like it was like a movie to me already. It was like a real-life mystery thriller. And with all the research that I had been doing over the past year, his research from his book went even deeper, and I just was really excited about it. It was just a wealth of information broken down in a way that I thought would make an amazing documentary. I saw that Children's Health Defense had opened their fellowship program, and the deadline was about a week away. I quickly applied and pitched the idea of doing a documentary film of the Real Anthony Fauci book, among other ideas that I had. And I was accepted to CHD TV. I'm thrilled to connect with the most extraordinary people. I couldn't believe my luck in connecting with such talented, highly skilled, thoughtful individuals from all walks of life, from all over the world, of various professional backgrounds. And we were all supportive and serious about making a difference. Then about 1 month into the fellowship, as fate would have it, I heard from CHD that there was a studio set up to produce the Real Anthony Fauci film for Children's Health Defense, and I was so excited. I asked to be connected. My CV was forwarded to the studio, and right away the studio had me start writing the script in February of 2022. The producer that contracted me to write the movie script told me that he usually uses another director who shoots interviews and just sort of intuitively develops the story afterwards in post. But in order to make a film adaptation of Bobby's book, we would need to have a script. And he said his studio had never worked off of a script before. So he asked me if I could do it in 3 to 4 weeks. And what that entailed was to read the book, break it down into chronological order. Bobby's book is not told chronologically, but I needed to create a concise chronological storyline while obviously staying true and faithful to the book. And then he also asked me to identify all people in the book that needed to be interviewed and write up all of the interview questions. The producer said he doesn't do voiceovers in his shows, and he wanted the interviewees to tell the entire story. Okay, so 3 to 4 weeks. I started February 14th on Valentine's Day and finished on my birthday 1 month later. So for me, once I have the opening in my mind, then I can sort of break down the rest in an outline format. So something I learned from working at the big television networks, there is a sort of formula that is pretty much guaranteed to engage your audience. Basically, the main takeaways that I always think about is that the beginning needs to pull in your audience right at the get-go, has to hook them in. And the ending of the movie, or the ending of the episode, the ending of the show, the ending of whatever it is, the ending needs to be memorable. The ending has to also have an impact. And then, I find that everything in the middle just sort of falls into place. It's kind of like you work that intuitively. So to pull in the audience, I was thinking, what is a common denominator with all people? And the first thing that came to my mind is that Bobby Kennedy, with his personal experience that he explains in the book, and it's very kind of like, it's so authentic, it's so honest, it's even kind of vulnerable. I thought anybody can relate to that, no matter who you are. Everybody has gone through some kind of trial or challenge or shock in their life that has brought them to another level of awareness. Even in the intro of his book, he does talk about why he's putting together this book. And so I really honed in on that, and then I had to think visually, what did I want that to look like? I had written down to the producer and the production manager my thought process on the opening sequence with Bobby. Here's what I wrote. In the book, just like real life, more is constantly being revealed to us. So I had this idea for the opening of the film. Visually, I imagine it can open with extreme close-ups on random objects, a letter, a stack of papers, details of the room, family heirlooms, a photograph. They're so close up that they're sort of obscure, maybe out of focus. Then little by little, more is revealed. The mood in the room is slow, thoughtful, quiet, like you are anticipating something. The camera eventually shows Bobby. He puts on his glasses, starts to read an excerpt from his book's introduction. It feels like you're sitting in the room with someone you know well, who is about to tell you something meaningful. And he begins to say,
"This book is a product of my own struggle to understand how the idealistic institutions our country built to safeguard both public health."
What I did was I selected a few passages from the beginning that I thought really encapsulated what you're about to see and experience.
I am a lifelong Democrat whose family has had 80 years of deep engagement with America's public health bureaucracy and long friendships with key federal regulators, including Anthony Fauci, Francis Collins, and Robert Käla. Members of my family wrote many of the statutes under which these men govern. They nurtured the growth of equitable and effective public health policies and defended that regulatory bulwark against ferocious attacks funded by industry. I built my own alliances with these individuals and their agencies during my years of environmental and public health advocacy, but I also watched how the industry, supposedly being regulated, used its indentured servants on Capitol Hill and its financial clout to systematically hollow out those agencies beginning in the 1980s, disabling their regulatory function and transforming them into sock puppets for the very industry Congress charged them with regulating. I explore the carefully planned militarization and monetization of medicine that has left American health ailing and our democracy shattered. I chronicle the troubling role of the dangerously concentrated mainstream media.
You're really attacking not only Dr. Anthony Fauci, you're attacking science.
Big tech robber barons, the military and intelligence communities, and their deep historical alliance with Big Pharma and the public health agencies. The disturbing story that unfolds here has never been told, and many in power have worked hard to prevent the public from learning it. The principal character is Anthony Fauci.
So it starts off with this sort of awakening, and then at the end, the memorable end that I wanted to build is that solution-based hope, inspiration, motivation, what we can do with this information in a positive way, to take the darkness and turn it into something light, something powerful. You can hear these stories and it could just make you fearful. It can just be sort of paralyzing. But that would never be the message that I would want anyone to walk away with, because it's also not the message of the book. Bobby Kennedy's last paragraph, bringing in Martin Luther King and and a powerful message of hope and change, and that if we stand together, we can accomplish anything. His last sentence was, "I'll see you on the barricades," which he has also said to crowds in rallies at different times in different places. But also just reading it in the book, it was very impactful.
Telling them today, you are not going to take away our freedom. You are not going to poison our children. We are going to demand our democracy back. Thank you all very much for fighting.
It's a privilege to be shoulder to shoulder with so many different kinds of people in the trenches, and my message to all of them is, I'll see you on the barricades.
I broke down the chronology into 4 parts, just to sort of keep everything organized, and so the first one, of course, starts in the 80s. So that first part would span 20 years. When Anthony Fauci became director of the NIAID, that was 1984, and I loved that it was 1984, for Orwellian reasons, of course. So it had to start 1984. It was just perfect.
Fauci's reign begins in 1984. Everything changes in 1984. Fauci becomes the director of the NIAID.
This saw the rise of Dr. Fauci to his current stardom.
I would like to introduce Dr. Anthony Fauci, who's the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases since 1984.
Dr. Fauci understood that he could basically save his government agency by defining AIDS as an infectious disease.
And then once Fauci partnered with Bill Gates in 2000, profiteering and dangerous gain-of-function experimentation really accelerated dramatically.
He had a bunch of international global health leaders that he invited to his home that was showing everyone in the tour of the house. And he said, "Can I have some time with you in my library, in this amazingly beautiful library?" And it was there that he said, "Tony, you run the biggest infectious disease institute in the world, and I want to make sure the money I spend is well spent. Why don't we really get to know each other? Why don't we be partners?" Our interactions and our collaborations became closer and closer with tuberculosis, with HIV, with the vaccine.
Starting in 2001, there was a new epidemic scare almost every other year. Whether it was a bioterrorism threat or of zoonotic origin, there always seemed to be something that was brewing, and Fauci was right there at the center of it all. Part 3 was the year 2020.
A SARS-like virus, which has infected hundreds in China, has now reached the United States.
We have already started at the NIH and with many of our collaborators on the developing of a vaccine.
The side effects for the Moderna vaccine sound concerning. We looked. After the second dose, at least 80% of participants experienced a systemic side effect. So, are these vaccines safe?
Well, the FDA, not being pressured, will look hard at that. The FDA is the gold standard of regulators, and their current guidance on this, if they stick with that, is very, very appropriate.
They have been working on this technology for a long time, but they've had a lot of problems with it. They haven't been able to get it to where it can work. It's too toxic. And they see this as a tremendous opportunity. And Fauci sees it, Bill Gates sees it. They've been heavily vested in this mRNA technology as a new revolutionary concept in biology, in medicine.
And part 4 was the year 2030 plus, or 2030 and beyond.
There will be other pandemics and other major health emergencies. No single government or multilateral agency can address this threat alone. Together, we must be better prepared to predict, prevent, detect, assess, and effectively respond to pandemics in a highly coordinated fashion. The 194 member states of the World Health Organization resolved to work together towards a new international instrument for pandemic preparedness and response.
This treaty involves some rather concerning propositions, and this includes that the WHO would have the authority in the event of another pandemic who would decide what the disease is called, how you would measure the disease, how you would test for the disease, the safety standards of the vaccines or whatever treatments they decide. It could be that these vaccines get developed in 100 days, which is totally ludicrous. Also, they could decide on who has to have them, whether they get mandated and so on, which is totally unacceptable and not to be tolerated.
So I put together the initial script, the first draft, during that first month of the project, from February to March 2022. Even though I was asked to, I was not able to write up all of the interview questions in that 1 month time slot, so I did that during the following months. The interviewees were such an integral part of the process. The studio's amazing production manager, Julie, was doing the scheduling for the interviews all around the country. I would give her a list of the interviewees that needed to be contacted, a short list, and she would get in touch with each one of them, schedule an interview date, and then I would send her the questions that needed to be asked. Because the producer had initially wanted the interviewees themselves to tell the entire story without narration, the questions for these individuals were very long and deep. In other words, they often spanned 4 decades from the 1980s until today, and asked for a lot of detail. I researched each one of their careers extensively. In Bobby's book, he uses certain individuals to talk about their experiences in the 80s, the 90s, and 2000s, and all the way up until 2020. I wanted to make sure I didn't miss a beat. It was enlightening to find that certain individuals that were speaking out on COVID and the mRNA treatments also had a long history dealing with the subject of pharmaceuticals and disease stemming all the way back to the 80s. Dr. Robert Malone was one of them. I was first introduced to him in 2021 during my personal research for Truth, when I found out that he was the original inventor of the mRNA technology that was being fast approved as a solution to the COVID-19 virus. What I didn't realize about Dr. Malone was that he was there behind the scenes from the 1980s, consistently working until today. He has deep connections with DARPA, with the DoD, the Department of Defense, with the military. When he was still in school, the mRNA technology was being developed as a hopeful for HIV/AIDS, and he was the original inventor. It was different then, as he describes.
The mRNA that I was working with and the inventions that I came up with are fundamentally different from what's being used in the current product, in that I was producing what is close to being a natural RNA. What's being used in the emergency use authorized products from Moderna and Pfizer-BioNTech are not natural RNAs, so they are related to what I'd originally envisioned, but also different. And those differences seem to have contributed to the risks and toxicities.
He was also there during the anthrax attacks in 2001. He has strong ties with insiders and was immensely helpful in explaining the history.
I know a lot of the people, I know where a lot of the bodies are buried, the nuance of what happened there, of the various groups that ended up acting in corrupt ways over time. I saw the initiation of the company that we now call Emergent Biosystems and its role in aggressively protecting its exclusive estate in anthrax vaccines. At Dyneport Vaccine Company, I took a position as the Associate Clinical Research Director. I played a role in almost all of the biodefense products. At that time, the Vice President of the United States, Dick Cheney, engaged in enabling a whole new biodefense infrastructure, really a whole new segment of the medical industrial complex.
Another individual who has a unique voice with such depth of character and heart and compassion was Vera Sharav.
That's one of the tragedies that is across the board when it comes to public health. Because you see, when doctors join forces with government, they no longer comply with medicine's mission and sacred oath to first do no harm to the individual patient. They become agents of government and they do what they're told.
She has a unique angle as a Holocaust survivor.
medical establishment facilitated both the lead up to the Holocaust and the Holocaust. The medical establishment went in lockstep with the government, and the first medical murder victims in Nazi Germany were German infants and children. Their crime was that they were disabled, not perfect. Over 1,000 children were medically murdered at hospitals that became murder institutions. It then spread to all children and adults with disabilities, to the mentally ill. There were two reasons that they used to justify. It was called T4. One was to cleanse the genetic pool of the imperfect, and the other was to get rid of the economic burden. People don't want to compare the Holocaust to anything else. Why? You've got to go with the truth. And no, we won't see gas chambers. No, we won't see crematoria. They don't need that. Now their weapons are technological. Australia has them already. The Nazis, by the way, didn't call it eugenics, they called it hygiene. It's always somehow with cleansing. But they're talking about murder.
During my deep dive research into her career background and through Bobby Kennedy's book, I found that her organizations were fighting against Dr. Fauci's corruptions way back as well, specifically that there were drug experiments on orphaned children, little children mostly from poor Black and Hispanic communities in New York City that were being used as guinea pigs for HIV/AIDS drugs, whether the children had been diagnosed with HIV or not. Court records show that many were harmed and or killed by these trial drugs.
Fauci, together with pharmaceutical companies, sponsored these experiments. I use the terminology that's used in the Nuremberg Code. These are experiments. They're not studies. These are invasive experiments.
If the children wouldn't take the drugs by mouth, then they would put in a gastric tube.
Some of the older children refused to take the drugs that were given to them because they were so horrible. So they surgically inserted a feeding tube in their tummies so that they couldn't resist.
Dr. Michael Yeadon was another very interesting interview. His background is working for the pharmaceutical companies over the decades, starting in the 80s.
When I was at the Wellcome Research Labs, I was very proud to be in a place that had discovered the first drug that became allegedly useful for AIDS. I knew that they'd found a new way to use an oncology drug, and I thought, well done to them. I had no idea. I was like 28. I'm just very happy. I'd never heard of Dr. Fauci at that time. I didn't know it was expensive, and I definitely didn't know it was that it was really poisoning people.
In fact, he worked for the now very well-known Pfizer. Essentially, he is a whistleblower, not because he worked for Pfizer during the COVID era, because he didn't. The fact is that he knows many of the players from Pfizer and other pharmaceutical companies that are now involved in the push for people to take this new mRNA shot for COVID-19, and he is privy to inside information.
Nucleic acid, our DNA and RNA are made of these little chemical bases, and when you modify some of them, they can jam the machinery of cells replicating.
Because of the vast amount of information in the book, I needed to cover about 4 decades from investigative journalists, doctors, scientists, etc., to tell the story. And a lot of the people that contributed to the Real Anthony Fauci book had been around from those days in the HIV/AIDS time period until today, the COVID period, and so much in between. It was just absolutely mind-blowing where it has Anthony Fauci's imprint along the way. Almost every single one of the 18 people interviewed for this movie had about 3 pages of questions that I deeply researched and wrote up. Selecting which people to go into the movie was also an interesting process because just like in a narrative, I thought about the personalities in the movie as I was selecting them. Not only was the content important to tell the story from start to finish, but if there was a personal account or an emotional or historic component to the story, if that person had a dramatic story to tell, that was going to be really valuable. In other words, I had to think about how certain things that I read in the book would actually look visually. So I had to sort of select people that were going to tell a story that I can create little kind of like mini movies within the movie.
I went to Hawthorne, New York, and I located this grave site. And what it looks like if you're standing before it, it was a semicircle of large tombstones with names engraved on the tombstones. I remember there were stuffed animals and flowers and hearts and things adorning those tombstones. And I also remember there were flies buzzing around. There was a mound, a gigantic hole in the ground covered by AstroTurf. And it wasn't nailed down, it was just covered. And I went over and I took a corner of the AstroTurf, and I remember, my heart was pounding. I lifted it up, and inside was just a lot of coffins. They were in there haphazardly. And apparently there was more than one child in each coffin.
The drug companies which have supported trials at Incarnation include some of the world's largest. They also refuse to be interviewed for this program. Officials at the National Institutes for Health insist that any participation of children in drug trials should be voluntary in every sense.
These little children are regarded as throwaway children. Nothing really was done to punish those who broke the law.
In the book, there were many voices, many experts, and riveting personal accounts from individuals that had spanned the decades. Some had close encounters with Fauci, such as Celia Farber, who had just incredible stories to tell.
HIV was never present by any means in all cases of AIDS, but Anthony Fauci made sure that there was a perfect correlation by eliminating about 5,000 HIV-negative AIDS cases. There was a conference in Amsterdam in the early 1990s, an AIDS conference. Doctors started to go to the podium in a session where they were talking about HIV-negative AIDS, and they began to say, yeah, I have some too. I have a clinical AIDS patient, has every symptom, but tests negative on every test, no matter how many times they test. And so there was a clamor, there was a sense of anxiety. Wait a minute, what is this? Could it be that Peter Duesberg is right? And Anthony Fauci flew in on Air Force Two to that conference, and he did his thing, and he quashed it, just quashed it. He gave a statement through Newsweek that this just wasn't an issue, it was a misunderstanding. And what they did at that moment was they took all of the HIV-negative AIDS cases and they renamed them and threw them out of the official definition.
One thing that was interesting and very sad was that there were individuals that I really wanted in the movie, and they had passed away. Carrie Mullis unexpectedly died of pneumonia in August of 2019, just about a month before the COVID virus started circulating in Wuhan. He was the inventor of the PCR test that is used today to detect COVID and was also used in the 80s to detect HIV. And he had been very outspoken starting in the 80s.
Guys like Fauci get up there and start talking, he doesn't know anything really about anything, and I'd say that to his face. Nothing. The man thinks you can take a blood sample and stick it in an electron microscope, and if it's got a virus in there, you'll know it. He doesn't understand electron microscopy, and he doesn't understand medicine, and should not be in a position like he's in.
He repeatedly said, including on tape, you should not use the PCR test to diagnose clinical infection with viruses. He repeatedly said that. What are we doing? Using the PCR test to distinguish clinical diagnostic tests with viruses.
They've got a personal kind of agenda. They make up their own rules as they go. They change them when they want to. And they smugly, like Tony Fauci, does not mind going on television in front of the people who pay his salary and lie directly into the camera.
When Bob Gallo proved that it was the etiologic agent in 1984, we had a diagnostic test approved by the FDA in 1985. That was really quick, from literally less than a year from the time that it was shown to be the virus that causes this disease.
And he continued to be outspoken in many interviews. Kary Mullis is a kind of superstar, and Luc Montagnier was another one. Luc Montagnier actually passed away, I believe it was right before I started writing this script. That was pretty devastating. He had been outspoken about COVID. All the way up until his death, he was studying the virus and came up with some shocking information. And he was around in the 80s with the AIDS and HIV because he is the one that found and isolated the HIV virus.
Luc Montagnier was always an interesting figure and always a thorn in the side of the orthodoxy.
HIV by itself, or some styles of HIV, are not sufficient to induce AIDS. Even from the beginning, actually, we thought maybe for the activation of that virus in cells, we need some cofactors.
Cofactors are not necessary.
So, approaching this adaptation, not only did I feel an intense responsibility to do right by it, but I didn't want to make it my own. I wanted to really make it the book. I wanted to make it loyal and faithful to all of the tremendous work and even personality that went into it. It felt like a very personal book, and it was in many ways because of his family and his own advocacy work. So I really wanted to honor that, and so I thought one way to do that would be to bring in the book as a sort of character itself. So we've got Bobby, we've got these co-stars, which are the other interviewees, and we also have the book itself. So the way I envisioned it, like this animation that came to life and the pages flipping and like diving into like an old treasure map or an old encyclopedia, getting to the page and then the camera moving into the words. And so that's another character in this movie. There are these really great subchapter titles in the Real Anthony Fauci book, and I had used them in the first draft of the script, but ended up not using them in the final, only because as we were going along and interviews are being added and certain things have to sort of move around to accommodate some unexpected, maybe new stories or things that maybe had to be taken out. The script, of course, is like kind of in constant flux, and somewhere along the way those little subchapter titles, which were really cool, I really wanted them on screen, but slowly disappeared from my script. But so that's one thing that I wish that I had time to put back in and find like a home for them, because they were really neat. And when the book has Bobby explaining neutral information such as facts and statistics, I assigned that information to one of the experts that we're interviewing, a physician, a scientist, a historian. So I would choose people who I found to be well versed on whatever that subject was, and then put the questions to them. As I was writing the script, as I was putting it together, I was also pulling images, writing, trying to visualize, and then try to grab things. I had already been doing so much of my own personal research starting mid-2020. So it's almost like without knowing it, I was sort of preparing to make this movie because I was collecting and downloading documents and videos and old documentaries and things that I thought could be scrubbed from the internet and things that were actually scrubbed from certain websites that I would then later find in, the archives online or somewhere. As a result, it was very cool that I had folders and folders of stuff that I had been collecting. But of course, there was so much more to do because, like I said, this book went even, just so much deeper than my own research, just so much farther. My research for this film included locating archival footage, images, using old documentary films, government documents, whistleblower accounts. But the extensive endnotes of each chapter in Bobby's book was the most important. Links to, it could be a documentary, it could be a government document, it could be, one of many things. So that was extraordinarily helpful. Because Bobby had done all of the research in this book, it ended up being much faster than had I had to do everything from scratch. However, I soon found that the censorship of this book was so pervasive, so insidious. For example, I would click on something that's supposed to bring me to, let's say, Anthony Fauci's leaked emails. The link reroutes to some other website. This one actually happened to me. It was actually a really interesting interview, so I got totally distracted for a few minutes while I was in the middle of trying to get this one thing. But, it's just another way of trying to invalidate all of this information, all of these facts. I thought that was really telling, really important. I really want people to know about that as well. Another one of my initial thoughts was that for Bobby's interviews, I chose only when he writes from his own perspective, his personal experiences, or that of his family's.
When I met with Tony Fauci, we had a very, very heated meeting. I was with Aaron Seary, who's another attorney, and Del Bigtree and Lynn Redwood. Sat across from the table from him and Francis Collins and the other public health leadership. And I said to him during that meeting, you've been publicly saying that there are safety studies done on these vaccines prior to getting a license. They say that there are none. There was an observer from the White House at that meeting. So he was under some pressure to defend his record. And he said, well, there are studies. And I said, can you show us any? And they made a show of looking through a series of briefcases and files to try to find what they were looking for. And they said, we'll send them to you. And of course, they never sent them. And at the end of that meeting, I was in the hallway, and Tony Fauci came up to me and took me aside and had a quiet conversation with me out of earshot of everybody else. And he said, I want to commend you for what you're doing. It's important work, and you keep us all on our toes. So thank you. And that was his message to me. You can be the judge of how earnest he was.
Bobby Kennedy's interview was the most extensive of all. Each of the other interviewees had to endure about 2 hours, sometimes more, of detailed Q&A. But Bobby had twice as much. In fact, he came in for 2 separate interviews, both hours long, and he was incredibly gracious and professional about it. His first interview happened in the early days of the project. Right after I completed the first draft, the appointment was made for him to come into the studio. I was asked to write up the questions. What was most exciting to me at that time was how the producer instructed his camera crew to create the look and feel of the opening that I had put down on paper. So at that early stage of the script, Bobby's only role was to talk about his own story, his personal awakening and his family's involvement in government health measures and policies over the decades. But later, as the script developed and evolved, there were missing pieces of the story that were unfulfilled by the other interviewees. It was decided that it would be all right for Bobby to be the one to fill in those blanks. 2 months before the final release of the film, Bobby came to the studio in Utah for a second time for a pickup. This time, I also flew in from New York to interview him. The interview went smoothly and fairly quickly, considering all that we needed to cover. He also read excerpts from the book in that session, which were used along with the book graphic. I wanted to make sure that during the course of the film, the viewer never forgets that this is an adaptation of his book. The important thing that audiences should remember is that this is a book, much like an encyclopedia, that should be in the homes of everyone. It is a book to flip through, to refer to for various important factors. After all, the book not only covers the career and corruption of Anthony Fauci, but also covers the entire past century, dating back to the Rockefellers in the early 1900s, and their ultimate influence on government policies as they created a change in medical protocols and medical health education.
In 1910, John D. Rockefeller really kind of took over medicine, particularly the medical schools. And they redirected medicine to be totally focused on pharmaceutical interventions and also various surgical procedures. In other words, to make it a real business. The Rockefellers are involved in everything. The World Health Organization, both Rockefeller and Gates.
So the script, of course, was ever evolving. It was always a work in progress. The production studio I was working for not only outsourced by hiring me all the way from the East Coast in New York to write and direct, but they also outsourced a husband and wife film editing team on the West Coast in California. The producer's intuition was on point when he hired all of us, because this really was a match made in heaven. We meshed so well together. Not only was the editing duo very much in sync with the look and feel of the script, they were also musically inclined. They not only edited the film, but created the entire soundtrack, which was so beautifully crafted. They were true artists. The way it worked with the editors and I was seamless and efficient, a workflow that really made the process move very quickly in meeting our goals. When we first started working together in June, I gave them the opening sequence to work on. That's how we all knew right away that they were a great fit. They really brought the script to life in the best way possible. The sounds and the music they chose were thoughtful and sensitive. They really captured the vibe. As the interview transcripts came in, I quickly inserted the sound bites and time codes into the script and delivered each updated section to the editors. So all while writing up and researching the next batch of questions for the interviewees, I was also updating the script section by section and delivering it to the editors so that they can then work on the next portion of the film. When the editors completed a section of the film, they would send the cut to me and the producer. I would then incorporate his notes with my notes and send all of the feedback to the editors to adjust or revise the cut. But again, the editors were so professional, so in tune with the whole project, the script, the health freedom movement, Bobby Kennedy's book in general, and everything, that it was all quite nice and very flowing. The last weeks of the project really picked up speed. The film editing duo in California had other engagements after their contract ended, so they were sad to leave us, and it was sad to lose them. The studio's editors were on multiple projects at once at that point, so it was all hands on deck. There were many last-minute changes and a barrage of emails and meetings. I had to record it all just to keep track. I helped out where I could with the film editing tweaks and revisions. Many members of the production team, the editors, the camera guys, and others, were nervous about the professional and personal blowback of going up against Fauci and the pharmaceutical industry, that they all wanted to black out their names in the credits. At the beginning of 2022, when I started this project, the social climate felt really hostile, so black and white, with no room for discourse, that I felt I would probably need to go anonymous as well. So when I was initially asked to be the ghost writer and director, I said yes. I had always valued my privacy anyway, so that is very much in my comfort zone. I didn't care about the credit. I didn't care about making a name for myself in this space. I cared only about the message disseminating and helping the book to get more exposure through the film. As the months went on, though, I saw that each of the 18 interviewees going on screen talked candidly about their careers, what they'd seen and experienced with Big Pharma over the decades, and the captured health agencies of our country. Then I started to feel an immensely strong urge to stand in solidarity with them. People like Vera Sharav, Celia Farber, Mark Crispin Miller all inspired me to rethink the idea of being anonymous. I suppose it was sort of the collective unconscious happening. The producer asked me if I would like to be named publicly as writer-director, and we drew up a new contract that attached my name to the credits and all public marketing materials for this 2-part film. There was no turning back at that point, and this was a turning point in my mentality, specifically my relationship to fear, one that was ultimately inspired by Bobby Kennedy. Because every time I felt scared, I thought about how he had taken the bullets in standing up to the most intimidating corporations, from big agriculture to big pharma. And even putting together this book right now took such courage. So it inspired me to be brave as well.